For people unfamiliar with you, please tell us your name and your background and basically what you've been doing for the last 40 years.
Well, that's really good. My name is Peter Breggin, Peter R. Breggin, MD. MD is important because it's a credential which my colleagues who are MDs find very threatening, because I've been confronting the medical profession from within for many, many years. I got involved in this work that I do as a college freshman at Harvard. I went out to a volunteer program to State Mental Hospital. And I walked into the hospital, and I'm Jewish, reminded me of my Uncle Dutch's experience of liberating a Nazi extermination camp. It was a giant facility up on a hill. The patients were living in abject dilapidation. Many of them looked like they were starving. They were being brutalized in the most horrible ways with shock treatment, giving them seizures and sticking electrodes against their heads. They were getting insulin coma. This is 1954. They were getting insulin coma, and that would put them in a convulsion because it deprives the body of, and the brain of enough sugar. It's insulin shock. And then they would become docile when they woke up. And people would go into the shock treatments, the electrical or the insulin coma, and they might be angry, upset, or they might look pretty normal or whatever. But when they came out, I could see as a Harvard freshman or sophomore what the effect was. It was making them docile. It was like beating them in the head. I knew that wasn't right. I mean, it takes indoctrination and a license and power and money to imagine that anything like that is right. And I was just looking at it. I sure knew I didn't want that done to me. And the doctors were authoritarian, and the patients with diagnoses. And I would sit down with the patients. One of the most stunning experiences was seeing this girl lying on the floor disheveled and being told she was a Radcliffe student until this had happened to her. And that's the sister school of Harvard. Now I think they're pretty much the same. And I thought to myself, there, but for the grace of God, go I. I mean, I'm a Harvard freshman. I'm barely keeping it together. I mean, what did she go through? And I had not planned to be a medical doctor at all. That was never even on the horizon. I was actually in an honors program inside Harvard. It was in American history and literature, which was really a valued program. And it was a good entryway to being a professor in many different directions, literature, history. And I was somewhat interested in psychology. I started going out to the hospital. And pretty soon I found that the patients seemed to get help when I talked to them and when the other students talked to them. So we built up a big program of a couple of hundred people, and I led it in, I think, my sophomore and junior year. And we asked the superintendent if a dozen of us could have our own patients. So they were designated that we would come and visit them every week. We'd be responsible. And I talked to a lovely social worker who would supervise the group for 2 hours a week, and that was all the hospital would have to expend on it. It was my first experience with me and authority. Superintendent said, "I run this place. That's ridiculous," or something. I said, "Well, sir, I know you run this place, but I was just visiting Boston State Hospital, and they're interested. If you're not, we could take the Harvard Radcliffe program there." All right. So we set the program up. Then the Boston Psychoanalytic Society president said we were going to ruin the patients. Now, here's a guy who's seeing rich people 5 days a week, 6 days a week, charges them if they take a day off, sitting in his office wearing a tie and jacket, and he's worried about us ruining some poor soul lying on the floor? I'd never seen any psychoanalysts at Metropolitan State Hospital. Well, we got about 12 patients. I described this in Toxic Psychiatry, what we did, and we ended up getting all of them except 2 or 3 out of the hospital, contrary to hurting them. And I realized that the whole system was crazy and damaging and destructive and hateful, and that a little love, and I can't tell you where I got the idea from because I didn't have a loving background. I said to myself, this is about caring for people, and they need caring. And I even started my first book, which eventually got published about 2 or 3 students later, about 2 or 3 years later. And my part in it was there, but they'd cut out everything I said about love. That didn't fit even then with psychiatry. Now it's forbidden in psychiatry because you give drugs, you don't give affection or concern or interest. The program lasted for a long time. We were cited in the National Commission on Mental Health in 2 places as one of the things that could turn life around in the state hospitals. We had an article in the biggest magazine at the time, the Saturday Evening Post, like a picture of me there sitting and talking with a patient. And I thought, this is wonderful. I'm a reformer. I can change psychiatry. There's places for people like me. There are psychologically oriented programs. Harvard was pretty psychologically oriented, Yale, and you could even do residencies in community psychiatry and social psychiatry. So I went into it, and by the time I was in 4 years in medical school, I could see the deterioration. The professors knew much less than I did about psychology. They knew less than me about the history of psychiatry. They were into drugs and shock treatment. There were psychoanalysts who also shocked their patients. And I was just at loggerheads with them, but there wasn't a lot they could do about me. I knew my stuff, and anybody could tell I was good with the patients. But they were so mad at me. The dean, fortunately, at Case Western Reserve, liked me. They were so mad at me that when it came to write up my recommendation for my rotation in med school, not afterward, through psychiatry, they're supposed to write up a page or 2 about you. The dean sat me down, he's laughing. He said, I got to read you the recommendation. the commentary on your tour of duty on psychiatry. He said, it won't take me long. And he read the sentence, which was basically, Mr. Breggin does not know as much psychiatry as he thinks he does. Didn't say I didn't know a lot. And then we used to take the national diplomat boards, which were, as you were graduating from med school, everything you learned on, or you had one on obstetrics, one on pediatrics, and there was a section, a test on psychiatry, and I think the highest score anybody had ever gotten on any of the sections at Case Western Reserve was like a 94 on any of the sections. And I got a 99 on psychiatry, so it was like, well, I may not know as much as I think I know, but I do know something. But of course I didn't agree with my answers to the questions. I knew what they wanted to hear. I had my own ideas. And then because I had a very good record, I got into the National Institute of Mental Health and the Public Health Service. Was that my military obligation was satisfied. Now I sometimes look back and think I should have gone to Vietnam, but I didn't want to go. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have stood up, even though I didn't believe in it. I don't know anymore. It's funny to look back. Boy, it sure made sense then. I didn't want to get killed or damaged, and so I got in the Public Health Service, and I got the plum of plums because I had a good record. I got to the National Institute of Mental Health. And I saw it all changing in front of my eyes in 1966 to 68. But what the most striking thing was what happened at Harvard. Because the year before I was at Harvard, I came and got interviewed. And I was interviewed by a family therapist and a psychoanalyst. And they told me all about how great it was. And both of them thought it'd be great to work with me. I already believed in family therapy, even though I was just coming out of medical school. I'd read it, and so on. And when I arrived, none of those people had power anymore. They changed the rules. You could only have 2 long-term therapy patients a year. It was all about medication, and it was all about controlling and administering patient lives. And there was no intense training in psychology, no serious reading at all in the field. And I met with Jerry Clairman, who was number 2 in the program at Harvard then. He later went on to be number 1 at the top of mental health in the federal government for a while. And Jerry knew me because I'd been really an active person in college. I feel like I had, a lot of years at Harvard because I've been working with him in college. And Jerry said, "What are you interested in, Peter?" He had a pretty good idea of who I was. And I said, "Well, I want to work on human beings, the idea of human beings and who we are, and personality theory, and be thinking ahead about understanding people, and writing books about them, doing therapy." And he said, "Pete, so you're not going to get anywhere with that." He said, "Peter, we're going toward computer diagnosis and drugs." I said, "I'm not going there, Jerry." And when I met all the residents, they were already there. They were people who had no feeling for patients at all. They'd come through Harvard and Yale, and they'd gotten straight A's to get into the Harvard program. I got in the Harvard program because they already knew me and I'd done all this stuff. I didn't have straight A's. I was good. I was an honor student, but I wasn't like these guys. And they'd spent all their time studying chemistry. All of them had taken many more courses than I had in the sciences. And they couldn't relate to people. And here they're put on an acute ward for the beginning of their residency with patients that the other doctors couldn't treat because they couldn't handle them in the community. They sent them to the Harvard Acute Treatment Center. And you got these nerdy, we didn't have that word then, but nerds can be very nice people. These guys weren't nice people. They were competitive, hard-ass. They'd gotten there. They didn't know how to relate to people. And we had a voluntary group seminar, which was actually a Tavistock therapy group, but they weren't told that. They didn't know that stuff. I knew that. It was a therapy group to help us develop, I guess. It was a remnant from the old psychology days. And they were saying things like, is this therapy? I don't want to be a patient. And I would say things like, if you don't want to be a patient, what does it say about what you feel about your patients? And they would say with their eyes, I want to kill you. I could see the profession deteriorating in front of my eyes. So I went on, and after a National Institute of Mental Health, I never thought I'd do it. I went into private practice. I loved it. And I consulted to some education departments and stuff. But I was doing private practice, and I was doing it without drugs entirely. And people would come out of the state mental hospital, which was St. Elizabeth's in D.C., hallucinating. They'd heard about me. They'd come in. I'd talk to them, and as I talked, they tended to get somewhat better. This was no shock to the old-time psychiatrists. Nowadays, it's unbelievable. And I developed long-term relationships with extremely psychotic and disturbed people by being nice to them, being patient, being courteous, being kind, being thoughtful, giving them maybe the first opportunity of their lives to have a meaningful relationship. And I would do regular more, talk about your childhood with more strong people who could relate, better. You treat people where they're at. You just help them along where they're at. And then I found out lobotomy was coming back. I had seen lobotomy patients. I was just reading a psychiatric newspaper, the lobotomy was coming back. And they were doing it by the old-fashioned lobotomy. You bore a hole in the head, you swish around a knife. They were doing it by planting radium seeds in the frontal lobes of the brain. They were doing it with other things that damaged tissue. And they honored the person honored in this, what was the second international psychosurgery conference of all time. The first was during the heyday in the 50s. They were honoring Walter Freeman, who'd done 5,000 ice pick lobotomies, pushing ice picks around eyeballs of people, hitting them with the back of the ice pick, and they'd go through the thin wall, the bone that's behind the eye, and swish it around. You can imagine what that did. And he used to show off and do it with both hands in front of amphitheaters. No one ever stood up to the man till I came along. No one ever stood up to that man. No psychiatrist volunteered to sue him in a lobotomy case till I came along. I decided I was going to stop lobotomy. Coming back. I mean, who knew? And I was in Washington, D.C., but I couldn't. I wrote a 100-page paper. I researched it. I wrote to all of them. At the time, I was affiliated with a famous institute called the Washington School of Psychiatry. I had that letterhead. Nobody knew who I was. They weren't afraid of me. Now, this wouldn't work. I wrote them all letters telling them how great it was, who I was, and I started getting in papers, including one that gave me nightmares and really turned me into the reformer. Little black children being implanted with multiple electrodes, I mean little like 5 and 4, in a state facility, and having their brains stimulated and having holes burned in their brains and walking around the wards with tassels of electrodes. A guy named O.J. Andy. And I had been, I don't usually talk about this, but I had essentially been raised by black women. We weren't rich, but my mom didn't want to handle any more boys. She already had one. It was enough for her. So I was raised by a black child from the age of 16. She was 16 for 4 years, basically. And then we had nannies. And I'm sure at some point in my life I thought I was a little black child. And I mean, that was just too much hearing about that. And then I found out that they were promoting psychosurgery. They had money from the LEA, the Law Enforcement Administration of the Justice Department. This is cloak and dagger, secret funding. As I started the campaign and tried to get it going, I actually got this brown envelope from somebody on the inside saying, "Peter, look at this. You're being." He didn't say we're funding you, but it was clearly from the Justice Department, secretly sent to me. And they were funding Harvard psychiatrists. And these Harvard psychiatrists, who were doing some of the remote stimulation, actually, were writing that the rioters in the 60s and the 70s, the black rioters, the leaders, had brain disease and could benefit from psychosurgery because, after all, nobody else was leading riots. I mean, that's stupid and that racist. And then they'd gone to Congress and they got a grant from Congress. Congress doesn't give grants to the NIMH. They voted a grant to NIMH. Said give it to Mark Irvin and Sweet, these Harvard people. And NIMH did what it was told, of course. So we had, way below the public view, combined funding from Justice and NIMH for lobotomies. Now, it didn't shock me as much as it might because I already knew the CIA had been funding electroshock experiments in Canada. And that had been exposed, it was in the New York Times. The doctor who was doing it was the most famous doctor in Canada, one of the most famous in America. So I really went to work, and eventually, the only way it was interesting, the only way I got it going, I got a congressman to research what I had written. His assistant went in, National Library of Medicine, which is in D.C., and researched the paper. He says, Breggin's telling the truth, Congressman. So he put it in the congressional record. So at least I had it in print. These are old days. But nobody would listen to me. I called one journal, and he said, well, these guys are friends of mine. What are you talking about? And so it was literally last ditch. I called Associated Press. I didn't know anything about any of this. And I said, do you guys have the congressional record? He said, yeah, you hear the clacking in the background? It's just pouring out. I said, well, that's good. I said, there's a terrible thing going on, and a congressman has put it in the record, people having their brains mutilated, little children, black children, 2/3 of the people are women, and it's really a terrible thing. He said, yeah, that sounds awful. And he said, but I'm sorry, sir, the science writer isn't in. And that was the big break, because I'd been turned down by every science writer. Washington Post, New York Times, didn't matter who they were. He said, sir, if you spell the words, I'd like to put that out as an AP release. And he did. And the psychosurgery campaign went off like a rocket. Eventually I shut down the stuff in Mississippi and the black kids. I shut down Harvard completely, and programs all over Europe. And one time they were forced to invite me to one of their big congresses by some civil rights people. I didn't have anything to do with what they did. I think they threatened to walk around with signs and something about it. So I got to debate the psychosurgeons. I was called into NIMH by its second in command to tell me I shouldn't try debating those people. They eat you alive, Peter. They're neurosurgeons. Well, I'm here to tell you that you don't have to be a neurosurgeon to be a neurosurgeon. They're dopes. They knew nothing about the brain. They called me an integrationist because I thought the brain was an integrated organ and you couldn't burn a hole and accomplish anything because everything was related to everything. An integrationist. I was a scientist. I didn't even know I was a scientist. I thought I was a psychiatrist. So, oh God, they were awful. The days were awful. I got a psychosurgery commission set up. I worked with Congress. I worked with the conservatives in Congress who actually walked into a senator's office whose main constituency was NIMH, my own senator, in Bethesda, Maryland. The last person. His constituency was Johns Hopkins, who wanted to do psychosurgery, but I stopped them. He was the last person as a politician you'd think would have the courage to say, I'm going up against these people. He gave me 5 minutes. I talked to him about it. He said, that's immoral. He said, anybody can tell that's immoral, doctor. You can't go in and burn holes in people's brains to change their behavior and their thoughts or slice their brains. He said, I'm going to back you up. And then I built a coalition with the right, people on the right. You wouldn't believe how right some of them were. And then I built a coalition with the Black Caucus, who was pretty upset about everything I've told you so far. And I worked with them, and we got legislation introduced to stop all federal funding. It didn't go through, but it sure scared them, and sure stopped them from doing a lot of stuff. Got the funding cut off. We did get the funding cut off to Harvard through NIMH. There's no more of that. And the Justice Department, there's no more of that. And I had a big impact. So people started saying to me, Peter, let's do everything here. What about shock treatment? And as I looked at each phase as I got involved, and by the way, even that early, there were threats against my life. Because some people understood that if this young man confronted what psychiatrists in particular were doing, because they were heavily involved with the lobotomies. Walter Freeman was doing lobotomies. He wasn't even a surgeon, using an ice pick. That what they knew is what I didn't know is if you let one psychiatrist stand up like this, will collapse. They knew it. Well, they were afraid of it. Well, they didn't collapse. So I've been working as a reformer in the electroshock area. First psychiatrist to ever stand up publicly and take powerful stands persistently. One or two other psychiatrists have whined about it once or twice, but I really take them on. We just had a massive victory against a manufacturer of shock machines. It's a big deal. There's only 2 of them in North America. A judge looked at what they were, the shock company tried to get the judge to throw the case out. He brought us to court on the grounds we had no evidence and there should be no case. And so I wrote an affidavit that proving to my satisfaction that every electroshock caused brain damage and multiple ones, just like a concussion, and multiple ones were worse than multiple concussions at the best. And the judge believed me. It was very interesting. He really believed me because he threw out about 6 things that our side was asking for, and then he zeroed in, and that was great. The lawyers love to throw out everything. Our lawyers, because he zeroed in, he said, now on the issue of brain damage, he said, and memory loss, there's enough evidence, scientific evidence, to give it to a jury, to let a jury decide. So they settled immediately. And then they did something we never expected. They made a report to the FDA, the Salve, the shock company. They made a report to the FDA saying that it was now known that electroshock caused brain damage, and doctors need to know this. And then they quoted stuff that had been around 10 years ago, in a report from the American Psychiatric Association that some people were losing vast portions of their memory. They claimed it was not very common. It's inevitable, actually, brain damage. So that was just a huge victory. So then the FDA immediately goes ahead within a week, and for the first time in its history, gave approval for electroshock for depression. It had never given approval. It was being forced to, it was forced by me and thousands of other people, a lot of patients who'd had it, a lot of groups, forced the FDA against its wishes to demand that we finally, instead of grandfathering old shock in, that we demand they test it, see if it works, and see if it harms people. And they just didn't want to do it. And then finally they said, okay, we'll do it. We'll put it in the category, which is the most dangerous, treatments, along with the drugs, things like that. And those fairly serious things. But we're not sure what we're going to do. But we put it in the category, which demands testing. So right after, and this is very recent, this is weeks ago, right after we won the victory and got the company who admitted it caused brain damage, the FDA issued a finding that it was not going to require any testing of electroshock, and they approved of it for treatment-resistant depressed patients. That is practically every patient, because almost nobody gets well from the drugs, and a lot of therapy is not good, and they don't get well from therapy. So they encouraged it. The FDA responded by encouraging doctors to now think that if the therapist didn't help, if the first drug didn't help, you now can go ahead and approve ECT. So it reminded me of something that people think gets fringy, but from what I've already told you, you know it's not fringy, which is the government wants these things not to go out of business. The CIA has an interest in mind control. There's an amazing new movie out, which I did not know they would say featured me. It's called The Minds of Men, and it was done by a couple of young people, relatively young by my standard, and it's already downloaded close to 1 million, The Minds of Men, and I'm in the last half of it a lot. And it's all about these control things, which I didn't even know about till I saw the film. I was talking about psychosurgery and electroshock and the things MK Ultra people knew about, the CIA funding LSD experiments on unwitting people. So my belief is that the government wants to protect these things. They fit somewhere in the weaponry interrogation area. It's got to be why they were funding electroshock experiments on literally erasing memories and minds and reprogramming people, women, to be more like what their husbands wanted. That's the kind of awful things they were doing. And they weren't the only people doing that, by the way. All that's documented in my 1979 my ECT book, and then later on in brain disabling treatments, then we learned about the funding of the ECT in Canada. So there's something goes on. And now there's this new thing, and depending on when this comes out, this could be the first film about it, which is that there's a lot of veterans at a private institute being subjected to magnetic wave treatment, and it's in the newspapers, and they're coming out and they're saying how much better they feel. Well, if you feel much better after something's done to your brain, that's brain damage. It's euphoria. You can't make the human being feel better, really, by pushing electrical energy of any kind, or any energy, through their brain. It's always going to disrupt this incredibly delicate, marvelous organ about which we know almost nothing how it functions. And so then I looked some more, and they're talking about hundreds of military and veterans and Navy SEALs have been given this new treatment. And it's harmless, and it makes them feel better. And I just think we're looking at another thing supported this time in the open by the military. And of course, it's a real cheap thing to do, and the persons after a while won't complain. Because what all this damage does, let me draw it to a fine point. What all this does, like the lobotomy, and that's what I began to realize, and why probably there was such outrage against me, such hostility, license attacks, which I obliterated one, hands down. They apologized to me. The license attack because I criticized drugs on Oprah Winfrey. It's a wrong attack. The press finally got interested in what I was doing because it was freedom of speech. New York Times finally thought, well, we love the lobotomists and everybody, but free speech, you know. So they wrote good stuff about me. Well, you see, the lobotomy effect is to cause indifference, apathy, and make you easily led. The only way these people, quote, did well was in confined places where they could be led around. They lost their free will. And that's what happens. You damage the frontal lobes, and we knew it all along. We knew it since the famous case in the 1900s where a man had a spike blown through his head, right through his eye and out the top of his head, and it did not damage a lot of his abilities, but he lost his self-control. He became a different personality. He didn't have inhibitions, frontal lobe damage. We knew all along how bad it was for people. And what I realized was the whole aim, as I read the psychosurgeons, was to make people not care about themselves anymore, not care about the consequences of their actions or their feelings or their loved ones. It was terrible. And a lot of families complained very, very bitterly about what was done to these people. Well, what is electroshock? In electroshock, at least one electrode is sending electricity directly through the frontal lobes, right at the tip of the memory centers and the temporal lobe. And the other one, at the most modern kind, has got the other electrode up here rather than here. But that's going through the skull. And then the brain, the head acts like a capacitor, so the electricity builds up around the head. You can't touch the head during the treatment, and so it's breaking through everywhere. And we know from animal studies it causes small hemorrhages, petechial hemorrhages, and cell death scattered throughout the brain. So electricity eventually goes everywhere, worse, not surprisingly, onto the electrodes. And it's the shock treatment, they say, well, that's true of the old treatment. The old treatment was so much safer than now. See, this whole business of these lobotomists and shock doctors, they're brutes. It is a form of violence against humanity. These are abusers. So they want to do it more and more. So the way you measure damage, and by the way, I'm talking about things I didn't talk about today, so that's good, isn't it? The damage is measured by the amperage of the current. Watts, 60 watts, 100 watts, the current. But then there's other measures that get into the resistance and to the time period of exposure. And one is called charge, other is called energy. Well, the average current, which is the basic beginning point for measuring everything, in the old days was between 90 and 110 volts. The modern machines that are used in North America give a fixed current. The doctor can't even change it between 800 and 900 milliamps. So the energies we give now, the charge we give now, the amperage we give now is about roughly 10 times more than it used to be. And we have a deposition where their chief engineer at the company we sued says you get more damage with more energy, more amperage. Yeah, of course, you get more cognitive damage, of course. So now it's always worse than it used to be. And in the old days, they not only gave much lower intensities of current, much lower amperage, they might give it for a split second, a tenth of a second. The machines go up to 6 seconds. We're devastating people much worse than we used to, and yet the FDA has grandfathered it in right in front of their noses with these guys raising The amperage never been tested. So the only thing I can think of, and it was that movie, The Minds of Men, that made me just realize that I've got to say something about it. And then now the stuff the veterans are getting, which is another variation on harming the head. It's like PTSD, and then you give them the equivalent of, some sort of damage. I don't know how much, because the stuff I'm seeing, they're not studies, and they never tell you what the energy is they're delivering. But it's for sure, if the men are coming out, if the SEALs are coming out, as they're bragging in the newspapers, feeling better, than they ever have, well, that's euphoria. And that's one way the brain initially responds to brain damage. You get silly, you get concussed, you have no judgment. It's not the most common. Most common, you get apathetic and knocked down, but you also can get euphoria. Now, if they get apathetic and knocked down, they say no longer complaining, no longer so many symptoms. And if you get euphoric, they say mood improved. They don't say even elevated usually, because that hints at something unusual. They say mood improved. Improved? They got brain damage, they're euphoric. So that's a lot of what I've done with my life that I didn't cover in my talk today. I want to cover something else that I didn't cover in the talk today. I talked about what happened in Nazi Germany. I want to help people understand. My talk is about the fact that psychiatric drugs are neurotoxins, and why would a profession give neurotoxins to people? So I gave the history and some of the background, as well as the evidence that they were neurotoxins. And including showing a book not written by psychiatrists, but by ER doc and neurologists about neurotoxicity, and it covers every single class of psychiatric drugs, describes the main characteristics of neurotoxicity, and I read to them, I showed them slides of neurotoxicity, of what the full prescribing information for the drugs did. And it prescribes exactly the general symptoms of neurotoxicity. Now, they were tied all together. But I wanted them to know about Nazi Germany, because in Germany, and you can hear more about this or read it on my website, www.breggin.com. In fact, it's under the drop-down menu of psychiatry as a tool of social control and political control, instrument of social and political control. I've written a paper on it that I gave in Germany at a medical conference. And they ended up exterminating all their mental patients independent of Hitler. When Hitler came in, they were ready to do it. And they built all the equipment that later became the Holocaust. They built the first killing centers, Sonnenstein, Hadamar, places people never hear of. And Hitler eventually closed that program because he really wanted to kill the Jews and the Gypsies and some of the Russians and the communists, the homosexuals, mainly the Jews, like me. And so the extermination, the last euthanasia center, which had, by the way, crematorium. I think they were more like open ovens. They had fake soap and fake showers, and poison gas. They developed all the psychiatry. These were the leading psychiatrists developed the euthanasia program, sometimes called the T4 program. It was a murder program. I shouldn't use the word euthanasia. And then they just built one that never got used because Hitler closed the program, and it was turned into an extermination camp. And they took the equipment from the euthanasia centers and shipped it to Poland and other places where the big murder centers were. But I told all that story. But this is what I didn't get to tell. In 1942, when American psychiatry, the leaders, knew about this, they for sure knew about this, and they knew that they had this massive sterilization program. They held at the APA meeting, the annual American Psychiatric Association meeting, a debate on what to do about 5-year-old, when children reach the age of 5 who were retarded and therefore hopeless. What do you do with them? And there were only 2 alternatives that they debated: murder and sterilization. Now, sterilization had been so rampant in the U.S. that our sterilization people went to Germany to reassure the Fuhrer that if he set up sterilization programs, nobody in America would bother him, because we were doing it massively in Virginia and California and elsewhere, tens of thousands of people. And that helped Hitler, go ahead and set up his first sterilization programs. And in fact, some of these people in journals called him the first mental hygiene Führer, leader of a country. Mein Kampf has some of this stuff in it, about the inferior people and stuff. But I don't think he ever talks about killing him. Mein Kampf. The first people to write about that were German psychiatrist and German lawyer in 1920, before Hitler had a lot of power. So what did they do? They had the debate, and then the editorial committee wrote an editorial for the official journal of the American Psychiatric Association. And guess whose side they came out on? They came out for the murder program, euthanasia. So my lesson was that psychiatrists think they're really nice now. So it's nothing for psychiatrists to think about, what? Giving a drug? That's beautiful. But if you want to hear about what the drugs are, how they're related to encephalitis, I'm going to leave that just sitting there. The origin of the main psychiatric drugs, the antipsychotics, is in injuring the brain in a way that is indistinguishable from a disease called lethargic encephalitis. And when they realized that, the psychiatrists back in the early 50s with Thorazine and Haldol, which is still in use, and now it's Abilify and Risperdal, they're just as bad, and Zyprexa and Abilify and Invega and so on, Seroquel. And most psychiatric drugs, because they affect dopamine, which is what the encephalitis affected, the dopamine neurotransmission, it really destroyed it, and so do the antipsychotic drugs. But a lot of drugs, antidepressants, stimulants, they all kind of mess with the dopamine. So they all produce some of what the encephalitis did, which is a blunting. It was called lethargic encephalitis. It's indifference, lethargy, not caring about yourself, not caring about other people, not caring if you're suffering, being more docile, and also abnormal movements, because that same dopamine comes from a place where the abnormal movements come from injury, which is basal ganglia. They start in the basal ganglia, they go right up to the frontal lobes. So you're damaging the frontal lobes, but at the same time movement disorders. And they cause Parkinson at the start, and then when they go further, they cause weird hyperactive movements. And actually, many of the new antidepressants cause that. The model, though, are the antipsychotic drugs. The stimulants cause some abnormal movements. So it's safe to say that the model of lethargic encephalitis is what we're doing to most of our patients. And the two psychiatrists who developed all this and then realized 2 or 3 years in that they were actually reproducing lethargic encephalitis, which had kind of died out in the 20s and there in the 50s, they were proud and excited about it. They tested patients to drive them up and demonstrate every symptom of lethargic encephalitis. And they wrote about it. They didn't say stop doing it. They said, look, we have the same neurotoxic pattern. So I've told it in a little different way. And I realized I had to tell it so it wouldn't look so strange. I mean, you got to know the facts to think, my God, what is this doctor saying? And I've written a paper on that. I've written one of the few modern papers on lethargic encephalitis and its relationship to the antipsychotic drugs. But it's only in recent times I realized, now wait a minute, many of these drugs also cause abnormal movements. So the whole pattern is there, and it's because they're hitting the basal ganglia. So that's what my life has been about. It's been full of threats of all kinds. It's been through an attack on my license that I won hands down. I've been threatened to be put in the president of the American Psychiatric Association many years back. at a cocktail party at the association, announced that he was a Harvard professor and a Harvard psychiatrist, so people there will figure out who he is real easy. And, Peter, we've been talking at Harvard, you know, I'm also a lawyer at Harvard Law School, so we think you're, it's Alan Stone was his name, we think you're committing a crime with some of what you're doing, and we think you could go to jail for this.
When you've received threats, I mean, have you, like somebody's written you a letter saying, stop doing what you're doing or else? Like, what type?
Yes, and there's been an attempt, I'll tell you a little about it. First time I'm beginning to talk about this stuff. Yeah, we got a series of threats. You're going to be killed on Christmas. You and your family are going to be killed on Christmas. And, you know, Happy Christmas built up. So I did call the FBI, and they came and they talked with us, gave us, told us what the case number was. And we called back, and they didn't have any knowledge of anything, of anybody ever coming to see me. And I even thought I knew who it was, because I thought it might be a celebrity from the way he was talking who had gone up against me and who was very badly injured. And I told him I thought it was. I just backed, you know, we're not going. But the worst thing was that during the early part of the attack, I was made the psychiatrist and scientist for all of the cases against Eli Lilly for the SSRI Prozac in 1990s. 150 cases. And I'm not necessarily blaming Eli Lilly. There were other drugs out. I don't know who's to blame. But when I did the deposition for Eli Lilly, I was quite sick. And my wife was sick. My daughter, our daughter was sick. And they were sicker than me. The reason they were sicker than me was I had built an office onto my home where I spent most of my time. It was above ground. Allie and my wife spent almost all their time in the house, which was above the basement. And we were going to doctors, we had lung ailments. And then a plumber came by one day and came back upstairs and says, Doc, Gingy, whatever. He said, your exhaust vent from both your furnace and your hot water heater have been removed and are lying out of sight behind the equipment. I think I may have once before told this on film that hasn't come out yet, I'm not sure. I've not talked about this before. It's a blessing I'm alive. It really is a blessing I'm alive. It's interesting, very few people want to do what I do. And it doesn't make me mad. I take the consequences, I do it. I've been treating patients for, a lot since 1966, really 62, not a long time treating patients. Now, one of my patients has ever become a reformer. One of them got so damaged that I think this person might become a reformer, but I'm not encouraging it. There's a person who does similar things to me in Europe named Peter Gertze, but he's come along much after I've survived, and he talks about that it's a genetic thing, you know. Some people are just genetically born to want to do these things. I don't know. But if anybody does want to do it, it's enormously fulfilling. My patients see that I'm a happy person, otherwise they'd get depressed. They know what I do because I'm really open with them, and they read my website and so on. But they also see that they don't want to deal with what I deal with. But I'm very proud of the life I've led. It's amazing to be looking back at it now from age 81 or 2, whatever it is.
Is it because of you that One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was made?
No, it came before me. Oh, it's an amazing movie, and I think film is the most powerful thing we have. I think film is absolutely, and now more people respond to my videos. I get 400 500,000 people watching one of my 10-minute videos. You know, if I had my books doing that well, I'd be a really rich guy. I want to end with one more story I didn't get to tell. The biggest accomplishment, the biggest fight I took on, the first biggest fight was the lobotomy. But we did another huge fight that had to do with children. And this is after my wife joined me, and we wrote a book about it called The War Against Children of Color. It was first published as The War Against Children because the publisher did not want to make it look like it was about black children and nobody bought it. And I had no control over the title in my contract. So as soon as they dropped it as a paperback, we got it published as War Against Children of Color. And it tells this story. It's about the story I'm about to tell you. And I'll do it in fairly abbreviated. But Ginger and I found out that the federal government was planning a government-wide eugenics program, essentially, to go into the inner cities of America and study inner city children before birth, to study their mothers, and then the children. This was tied to the Genome Project, so you know what they're doing. The Genome Project was involved with it, but so was mental health, so was the children's programs, so was the neurology programs. They were going to go to Congress with a massive, and they were going to see what made little black kids, they never said that, inner city children, violent. It's like it's in their genes. Actually, the inner city kids who become violent are probably often the most amazing and wonderful of the kids who just don't have the upbringing and the ability to say, I'll go to Harvard and reform the world. So they're gonna face it right there. And they might be some of those leaders that they wanted to lobotomize in the first wave of the same kind of thing. And the whole thing was that we also got some notes, secret notes sent with FOIA. I always have friends I don't know in the government. They sent me a note, handwritten note. The leadership was linking it to marketing Prozac in the community to control violence. So it was already known that it caused violence. I mean, that's how crazy it all is. But it does tend to make people more docile and less thoughtful and involved with themselves. And I couldn't get anybody to take that up anymore. I couldn't get any big medical person to take up the lobotomy issue, and I couldn't get any big medical people to take up the war against children. And but boy, I got the Black Caucus, the U.S. Congress, to once again, they had to come to my aid in the reform work in the beginning. And boy, did they come to my aid when the license attack came. I'll tell you what. When I came under attack, I called the top African-American congressmen and I said, I'm under attack. I need letters from people. I need them in a week. I'm so sorry. And 2 congressmen said to me, Peter, you write your letter and I will sign it. I mean, oh my God, I didn't know they'd remember me. Who's that kid? That short Jewish kid? Is that who it is? You write the letter. I mean, that's something you say to somebody you trust with all your heart. And I did, and they read the letters, and I don't remember if they changed them at all. I don't think so. And they sent in letters. I just described my work with them. It was honest to God work with them. But the Violence Initiative gets into a massive mistreatment of children. I don't want to talk about it for a minute. I didn't talk about it today. So, you know, the stimulant drugs turn our kids into good caged animals. If you give Ritalin or amphetamine, which are the basic drugs, Adderall, to a happy chimpanzee, it doesn't get happy anymore. It stops playing, it stops roaming, it loses its curiosity, it stops kissing, hugging, it stops participating in the contests they have for dominance. And the chimp, stops all or most spontaneous behavior, and B, does obsessive behaviors, which in the animal studies are called meaningless activities that serve no purpose. School, maybe. So if you will, and they call it stereotypical behavior. So if you make children lose their social spontaneity. They sit in class, they shut up, they don't talk with their friends, they may not even relate on the playgrounds. And you make them OCD, you give them this perseveration or stereotypy, then they'll copy off the boards, they'll do whatever they're told, they'll tear the paper. This has been found in studies, but they don't learn anything. The only main thing that we know that we can document is that they don't improve, except for a few weeks till the brain fights back, and they lose their height and their weight, their development, their hormones, the particular growth hormone is all messed up. So it's just an atrocity against children. But what we've done to our kids, and I can end on this, is we've turned them into a market. Kids did not used to be the primary market of every avaricious program in the world. And now what are we doing? We're marketing drugs to them through their parents and even through the kids themselves. And NIMH is doing it. The education department is marketing drugs to our kids. The drug companies are marketing to their kids. Well, one drug company, Johnson & Johnson, paid a Harvard psychiatrist, Biederman, money under the table. I was the first to blow the whistle on that too. But then Senator Grassley confirmed it and found there was even more money to create childhood bipolar diagnosis and to drug our kids with antipsychotics on behalf of Johnson & Johnson, its subsidiary Janssen. We're marketing violent videos. We're teaching our kids violence by giving them what are essentially training films. These shooting things, they originated as Army training films, and now they're mass murder films, not like the Army training films. So we give them that, and we're surprised that a lot of the shooters have been on these things. With violent videos, the terrible food. I'm a deep believer in Pam Popper in particular. She's really taught me, and she's really helped me get rid of all my what I thought were my old age illnesses. I don't have high blood pressure anymore. I don't have asthma anymore. I really believe in the plant-based diet. My wife doesn't have ulcerative colitis anymore. Plant-based diet. I want to get that in. I'm really a team member here. I was totally skeptical until 2 years ago. Then bang, I decided to try it because Pam kept inviting me to conferences. I kept learning. So we're marketing all this junk to our children. We turned them into the object of marketing. What goes on the TV. And it's about time to say, or to organize against marketing to our children to make money. And we got to stop the drugging, we got to stop the violent videos, we have to stop the violent, horrendous, extremely male oppressing women songs and so on. There's just so much. You get the food, they get the worst food, our kids. Junk food marketed on TV. So I would end on that note. Let's stop marketing poisons and junk foods and horrible entertainment to our children.